For nearly 80 years, the official story has remained unchanged. Adolf Hitler, the Führer of Nazi Germany, took his own life on April 30th, 1945, inside a fortified bunker beneath the crumbling streets of Berlin. His death, it's said, ended one of the darkest chapters in human history. But as the war drew to a close and Allied forces occupied the city, the mystery surrounding Hitler's final moments deepened. No definitive forensic evidence was ever made public. The supposed remains vanished into Soviet custody, and witness accounts often contradicted one another. In the decades since, whispers of an alternate ending have persisted, a tale of escape, secrecy, and survival. Could the world's most wanted man have evaded justice, fleeing across oceans to live in exile? This investigation revisits the evidence, the witnesses, and the theories surrounding one of history's most haunting mysteries. Welcome to Echoes of the Unknown, where we dive deep into the unsolved, the unexplained, and the downright unbelievable. My name is James, and today we're looking at one of those that refuses to go away. Like the faked moon landings and Elvis still living and working in Walmart, the idea that Adolf Hitler, the most infamous man in history, managed to escape from Berlin and escape is a story that some corners of the world still believe is true. We will look at the theories and see if we can debunk them. If you like stuff like this and want to see more, don't forget to like and subscribe to really help the channel grow. For now though, strap yourself in and make sure your tinfoil hat is firmly in place, because here is the full story of how the Austrian painter could have survived. To understand the enduring mystery of Adolf Hitler's alleged escape, one must first revisit the extraordinary and horrifying journey that made him the most infamous man in modern history. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, a small Austrian town near the German border. The son of Alois Hitler, a strict customs officer, and Clara Pölzl, a devout and protective mother, young Adolf grew up in a household of tension and ambition. From an early age, he exhibited a volatile temperament, coupled with a fascination for German nationalism and an obsessive belief in destiny. After a failed bid to enter the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, Hitler lived in poverty, selling postcards and sleeping in hostels. It was in his politically turbulent streets of Vienna that his deep-seated anti-Semitism and hatred of Marxism began to take shape, beliefs that would later infect an entire nation. When World War I erupted in 1914, Hitler enlisted in the German army. He served as a messenger in the Bavarian Reserve Infantry, earning the Iron Cross for bravery but never rising above corporal. For him, the war was more than service, it was revelation. Germany's defeat in 1918 shattered him. He came to view it as not as a military loss but as a betrayal, a stab in the back delivered, he believed, by Jews, communists, and weak politicians. In the years following the war, Germany teetered on the brink of collapse. Economic depression, political extremism, and humiliation from the Treaty of Versailles created fertile ground for demagogues. It was in this chaos that Hitler found his calling. Joining the small German Workers' Party, he quickly rose to prominence through his fiery oratory and magnetic charisma. By 1921, he had transformed the party into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. Failed beer hall putsch of 1923 landed Hitler in prison. The event turned him into a national figure. During his 9 months behind bars, he wrote Mein Kampf, laying out his twisted vision for Germany's future, racial purity, territorial expansion, and the destruction of those he blamed for Germany's suffering. A decade later, those ideas had taken root. In January 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Within months, the Nazi regime had dismantled democracy, silenced opposition, and unleashed a campaign of indoctrination and terror. The Reichstag Fire Enabling Act and Night of the Long Knives cemented his total control. The once chaotic republic was now a totalitarian state, with Hitler as its unchallenged Führer. Under his rule, Germany experienced rapid economic recovery and resurgence of national pride, but it came at a cost. The regime persecuted Jews, communists, and anyone deemed undesirable. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 stripped Jews of citizenship, and by 1938's Kristallnacht, Nazi violence was no longer hidden but celebrated. Hitler's ambitions soon turned outward. In 1939, his invasion of Poland triggered World War II, plunging Europe into chaos once again. The Nazi war machine, Blitzkrieg, swept through the continent with terrifying speed. France fell in 6 weeks, London burned under bombardment, and across the continent, the Gestapo enforced Hitler's vision with unrelenting cruelty. As his armies expanded, so too did his genocidal agenda. In 1941, the final solution began, a systematic, industrial-scale extermination of Europe's Jewish population. Millions were deported to concentration camps, where they were murdered in gas chambers, starved, or worked to death. By the war's end, 6 million Jews and millions of others, Poles, Slavs, Romani, disabled citizens, and political prisoners, were dead. While his empire appeared unstoppable in the early 1940s, the tide of war soon turned. The disastrous invasion of the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa, combined with the entry of the United States into the war, sealed Germany's fate. By 1943, the Axis powers were on the defensive. Allied bombing reduced German cities to rubble, and the Eastern Front became a slaughterhouse. By 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. Hitler, increasingly paranoid and delusional, retreated to the Führer bunker, a concrete labyrinth beneath Berlin's Reich Chancellery. Here, in claustrophobic isolation, he dictated orders to armies that no longer existed, and placed his faith in miracles that would never come. Witnesses described him as a shadow of his former self, shaking, pale, his once fiery speeches reduced to incoherent rants. Those closest to him, including his longtime companion Eva Braun, stayed by his side, though most knew the end was near. On the surface, Hitler's story appears to conclude on April 30th, 1945, when Soviet troops closed in on Berlin and the Nazi leader allegedly took his own life. Yet the chaos of the final days, the destruction of evidence, and the tight Soviet control over the narrative would leave historians and investigators with more questions than answers. What truly happened in that bunker? Were the charred remains really Adolf Hitler's, or somebody else's? And how did so many reports years later place the Führer not in a Berlin grave, thousands of miles away in South America? The legend of Hitler's death, or escape, begins in those final desperate hours beneath the Reich Chancellery. In the final days of April 1945, Berlin had become a city of ruins. Soviet artillery thundered endlessly, shaking the ground above the Führer bunker, the subterranean fortress where Adolf Hitler and his remaining loyalists had taken refuge. The once proud capital of the Third Reich was reduced to rubble and ash, its streets filled with civilians scavenging for food, and soldiers fighting hopeless battles against the advancing Red Army. Inside the bunker, morale was crumbling. Stale air carried the scent of damp concrete, sweat and desperation. The lights flickered as the generators struggled to keep power. Hitler, once a man of fiery speeches and manic energy, had become a pale, trembling figure. His hands shook uncontrollably, his mind consumed by paranoia and delusion. Reports from the front were grim. The Soviets were closing in from all sides, and no German reinforcements would ever come. The last of his generals, including Wilhelm Keitel, Alfred Jodl and others, came to deliver bad news. The Wehrmacht was finished. Hitler, in denial to the end, raged and blamed everyone around him, his officers, the German people, even his closest confidants. He declared that if the war was lost, the nation had failed him and deserved annihilation. On April 28th, word reached the bunker that Benito Mussolini, Hitler's ally and counterpart in fascism, had been captured and executed by partisans in Italy. His body, mutilated and hung upside down for public display, served as a brutal warning. Witnesses say Hitler read the reports in silence, his expression hardening with realization. If captured, he too would face humiliation and death at the hands of his enemies. That same day, Hitler hastily married his longtime mistress, Eva Braun, in a small, dimly lit ceremony within the bunker. The witnesses, Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann, signed the register as champagne was poured from dwindling supplies. For a brief moment, there was forced laughter, a grotesque parody of normalcy amid the apocalypse. The next morning, April 29th, Hitler dictated his final political testament. In it, he blamed the Jews for the war, declared his loyalty to Germany, and appointed Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor. The document ended with his refusal to surrender. There would be no negotiation, no flight, only death. But what followed remains shrouded in controversy. On April 30th, sometime after 3 p.m, Hitler and Eva Braun withdrew into his private quarters. The staff outside reported hearing a single gunshot. When they entered, they found Hitler slumped on the sofa, a bullet wound to his temple, and Eva Braun beside him, apparently having swallowed cyanide. Their bodies were later wrapped in blankets, carried up to the garden outside the Reich Chancellery, doused with petrol and set alight, an order Hitler had given himself. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, remained fiercely loyal until the end. After Hitler's death, he and his wife poisoned their 6 children before taking their own lives. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, attempted to flee the city but was reportedly killed during the escape, though his fate remains uncertain for decades. General Wilhelm Burgdorf and Hans Krebs, 2 of Hitler's senior military officers, also committed suicide within the bunker. Others, such as Heinrich Himmler and Hermann Göring, had already abandoned Berlin, seeking to negotiate with the Allies or save themselves. The bunker became a grim tomb of loyalty, fear and delusion, as Hitler's once mighty inner circle collapsed under the weight of defeat, and the reality that the empire they built had come to a violent, inevitable end. Soviet troops entered the bunker 2 days later. What they found were charred remains, but no definitive proof of identity. In the chaos, stories emerged, conflicting accounts from witnesses, shifting Soviet reports, and evidence that vanished into secrecy. From that ambiguity, a legend began, one suggesting that Hitler never died in Berlin at all. In the spring of 1945, as the Red Army closed in on Berlin, the world believed it was witnessing the last act of Adolf Hitler's reign. Official record claims that on April 30th, inside the Führer bunker beneath the ruins of the Reich Chancellery, Hitler took his own life alongside Eva Braun. Their bodies were said to have been carried up the narrow staircase to the garden above, doused in petrol, and set ablaze under the collapsing sky of the dying Reich. Soviets claimed to have recovered what remained, but from the very beginning, that account was incomplete, filled with inconsistencies, conflicting statements, and missing evidence. It's from one of these gaps that the legend of Hitler's escape was born. When Soviet troops captured the bunker complex in May 1945, they immediately sealed it off. Access was tightly controlled, and for years, no Western investigators were permitted to examine the supposed remains. Stalin himself refused to issue a clear public statement. At times, he told his generals that Hitler was dead. At other times, he hinted that the Führer had fled. To the west, he implied escape, to Spain, perhaps to Argentina. His motives were likely political. But by keeping the mystery alive, Stalin could justify continued military vigilance and sow distrust amongst the Allied powers. Yet the Soviet secrecy also created an information vacuum, and into that vacuum poured rumour, conspiracy, and half-truths. Soviets claimed to have identified Hitler's remains through dental work. Their evidence was never independently verified. Fragments they presented, a skull and a jawbone, were kept under lock and key in Moscow for decades. When forensic scientists finally gained limited access many years later, the results were shocking. DNA analysis suggested the skull fragment belonged not to Hitler, but to a woman under 40 years old. The jawbone, which Soviet experts insisted matched Hitler's dental charts, remains contested. Without open access or a documented chain of custody, its authenticity cannot be fully confirmed. The world was left with 2 grim possibilities. Either the Soviets had misidentified their evidence, or the remains were not Hitler at all. Uncertainty birthed the first of many theories, that the death in the bunker had been staged. According to this idea, the body burned in the garden was not Hitler, but a double, carefully selected and prepared in the final days of the war. The theory draws strength from the chaos of Berlin's fall. Communication lines were shattered, witnesses were terrified, and the bodies once burned were barely recognisable. Hitler had been known to employ lookalikes for public appearances and decoy convoys, so the notion that one may have been used in his death was not unthinkable. Some accounts even describe an unexplained corpse found near the bunker entrance, a man of similar height and build, dressed in Hitler's uniform. Confusion of that moment could easily have concealed a substitution. Yet despite the intrigue, the theory faces challenges. Dental records, when compared to the Soviet-held fragments, do appear consistent with Hitler's known dental work. Eva Braun's bridge work was also reportedly identified. However, all of these findings rely on Soviet sources. Without independent verification, skepticism persists. What remains undeniable is that the Soviets' refusal to release conclusive proof allowed suspicion to take root. For others, the explanation was far more audacious. They believed that Hitler had physically escaped from Berlin before the Soviets arrived. The idea sounds impossible, yet Berlin in April 1945 was a maze of tunnels, cellars and bunkers, many of them interlinked beneath the streets. Reports exist of Nazi officials and soldiers using these routes to move between districts even as Soviet artillery rained down above them. One theory suggests that Hitler used these subterranean passages to reach a hidden airstrip at Teltow or Brandenburg, where a small aircraft waited to take him to Denmark, Norway, or even Spain, still neutral territory at this time. Eyewitnesses spoke of frantic activity at certain Berlin airfields in the final hours, with planes departing in defiance of orders. Others claim that a convoy of vehicles carrying high-ranking officials left the city through back roads under the cover of night. Could Hitler have been among them? On paper, such an operation would have been near impossible. By late April, Berlin was surrounded, its airspace dominated by Soviet fighters. Still, the idea persists, partly because fragments of truth underpin it. Planes did leave, tunnels did exist, and several senior Nazis did, in fact, escape the capital during that period. From this supposed airlift, the story expands into an even greater voyage, one that stretches across the Atlantic Ocean. In this version, Hitler is said to have been transported by U-boat to South America. The theory gained traction after two German submarines, U-530 and U-977, surrendered to Argentine authorities months after Germany's surrender. Both had crossed the Atlantic under mysterious circumstances, their crews offering inconsistent accounts of their journeys. They claim to have destroyed sensitive materials at sea before surrendering. The local witnesses along the Argentine coast reported strange landings, small boats approaching shore at night, shadowy figures disappearing inland. Some believe that among these figures was Adolf Hitler himself. Argentina, under President Juan Perón, had become a haven for fleeing Nazis. The Peronist regime's sympathies towards Germany and its lax immigration controls made it an unideal refuge. In the years after the war, dozens of former SS officers, Gestapo agents and Nazi doctors found safe haven there, among them Adolf Eichmann and Joseph Mengele. Many used false identities, aided by networks known as the Rat Lines, which stretched from Italy and Spain to Buenos Aires. If such networks could spirit away figures like Eichmann, it wasn't unthinkable that they could have done the same for Hitler. Eyewitness reports began to surface from remote corners of Argentina, Chile and Paraguay. Locals told stories of a tall, older man with a distinctive moustache, living under an assumed name on a ranch in Patagonia. Declassified FBI documents from the late 1940s even contained tips from informants claiming that Hitler was alive and being sheltered by powerful sympathizers. The FBI investigated several leads but found nothing conclusive. One 1945 report described a German couple living near San Carlos, both middle-aged, the man often seen in the company of former SS members. No proof ever surfaced. The story refused to die. As more Nazi fugitives were discovered living comfortably in South America, the theory seemed less outrageous. Eichmann's capture in Buenos Aires in 1960 reignited interest in the idea that Hitler could have taken the same path. Ratline networks were real, and elements within the Catholic Church, the Red Cross, and sympathetic European officials had all been complicit in smuggling war criminals out of Europe. Some researchers believe that the Spanish dictator Francisco Franco and Portuguese leader Antonio Salazar both turned blind eyes to Nazi refugees passing through their territories. Under such conditions, it's conceivable that a fugitive, even one as infamous as Hitler, could have slipped away amid the tide of chaos and desperation that followed the war's end. Still, the practical barriers are staggering. Moving Hitler from the heart of Berlin to Argentina would have required an immense and coordinated effort. Aircraft, submarines, false identities, medical care, and secrecy from dozens of participants. Each new layer of the plan increases the chance of exposure, and yet, in nearly 80 years, no definitive physical evidence, no photograph, no verified document, no authentic DNA sample has emerged. Then there are intelligence files. During the early years of the Cold War, both the CIA and the FBI maintained open cases on the possibility that Hitler had survived. Hundreds of sightings poured in from around the world, South America, Spain, and even Africa. Most were quickly dismissed as mistaken identity or deliberate hoaxes. Some were taken seriously enough to warrant field investigation. In several instances, American agents interviewed witnesses who described men bearing striking resemblances to Hitler, often living under assumed German names in remote areas. The reports, though unverified, helped sustain the myth. Soviets, too, appeared divided on the issue. Even into the early 1950s, high-ranking officers within Soviet intelligence occasionally voiced doubt about the authenticity of the remains they held. This inconsistency provided fertile ground for conspiracy theorists. If both superpowers were uncertain, perhaps the truth had indeed slipped away. Modern forensics has attempted to provide closure. In 2009, an American researcher was permitted to test a fragment of skull long claimed by Russia to be Hitler's. The results were startling. Bone belonged to a woman. The Russians responded by asserting that the fragment had been misidentified and that the true remains, a jawbone, were still intact and genuine. But no independent forensic team has ever been granted unrestricted access to those bones, and without that, doubt lingers. The only definitive way to settle the question would be to perform comprehensive DNA analysis and compare it to living relatives of Hitler. To date, such testing has not occurred. For many historians, the simplest explanation remains the most convincing, that Hitler did, in fact, commit suicide in that very bunker. His psychological deterioration was well documented in the final weeks of the war, his delusions growing darker as Germany collapsed around him. His final testament, dictated to his secretary, reads like a man determined to end on his own terms. Witnesses, secretaries, aides, guards, all recounted the smell of burnt flesh, the sound of gunfire, and the hurried disposal of the bodies. Yet even within these accounts, inconsistencies appear. Some heard only one shot, others two. Some saw the bodies, others did not. These contradictions, while explainable as confusion, are enough to sustain skepticism. For believers in the escape theory, the motive is the key. They argue that Hitler, obsessed with self-preservation and distrustful of everyone, might have orchestrated a dramatic disappearance. To them, suicide would be out of character, an act of surrender for a man who had built an entire empire on fanatic defiance. To others, however, suicide was entirely in keeping with his warped sense of destiny. Better to die by his own hand than face humiliation at the hands of his enemies. Ultimately, the persistence of the escape theory speaks less to what we know than to what we don't. Stalin's obfuscation, the Soviets' mishandling of evidence, and the genuine existence of Nazi rat lines all give the theory just enough oxygen to survive. The Cold War then amplified it. Both sides found unity in keeping the question alive. The Soviets to justify their suspicion of the West, and Western intelligence agencies to rationalize continued surveillance of potential Nazi networks. Over the decades, rumor hardened into folklore. Books were written, documentaries produced, and eyewitnesses continued to emerge, often decades after the fact, with memories blurred by time. What is clear is that the legend of Hitler's escape tells us more about human psychology as it does about history. When a crime is this vast, this horrific, and this defining, the mind struggles to accept an ending so small, a single gunshot in a concrete bunker. For many, that conclusion feels too neat, too undeserving of the scale of his atrocities. To imagine that he slipped away to live in obscurity is not just to question history, but to express an emotional need for justice that still feels incomplete. Despite the intrigue, despite the gaps in evidence, the overwhelming consensus among serious historians remains unchanged. Hitler almost certainly did die in Berlin on April 30th, 1945. Yet because of Soviet secrecy, conflicting witness testimony, and the enduring mysteries of the post-war years, the question can never entirely be closed. Until every fragment of evidence has been tested, until every claim has been definitively ruled out, the door, however slightly, remains ajar. And that sliver of uncertainty is enough for the theories to persist, for the files to remain open, for one of history's darkest chapters to linger just beyond the reach of final proof. Nearly 80 years after the fall of Berlin, the mystery surrounding Adolf Hitler's fate refuses to die. Official history insists that the dictator ended his life in the bunker on April 30th, 1945, a fittingly bleak conclusion to one of humanity's darkest chapters. Yet the absence of definitive physical proof, contradictions in Soviet reports, and the volume of credible post-war sightings continue to raise unsettling doubts. Across the windswept coasts of Patagonia, in dusty FBI archives, deep within Moscow's sealed vaults, fragments of the story remain scattered. Each clue, a declassified memo, a witness account, a flawed forensic test, adds to a mosaic of uncertainty. Perhaps Hitler died beneath the ruins of Berlin, or perhaps he lived on, hidden among the exiled architects of the Third Reich, waiting for history to forget. Until undeniable evidence emerges, the fate of Adolf Hitler remains one of the most enduring and disturbing enigmas of the 20th century, a shadow of evil that may have escaped into the world it once sought to destroy. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Echoes of the Unknown, one of those myths and legends that on the surface seems completely insane, just like the subject himself, but with just enough crumbs to spread a sprinkle of doubt. Personally, I still believe he took the coward's way out and did himself in, but what do you think? Did he escape to Argentina along with some of his other cronies? Did he end up on the secret Nazi base on the moon? Or did he live his days out in an old people's home with Elvis and JFK? Pop your thoughts in the comments below. We've got lots of coming up on the channel, including part 3 of the Crystal Lake Massacre series and some Christmas-themed episodes scheduled, so remember to subscribe so you don't miss out. Also, give the like button a good old poking as if it was Hitler's eye, as all this good stuff only helps the channel. Again, thanks for tuning in. That's enough of my jibber jabber for today. I'll be back soon, so until then, stay safe and remember, keep listening for the echoes.